Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Endowment for Middle East Truth's weekly webinar featuring Asaf Romirowsky discussing the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, as we all refer to it, and how it operates. This topic is extremely timely given the Biden administration's plans to begin funding of UNRWA again after the Trump administration cut off our support, and so soon after Hamas's war on Israel from Gaza, where UNRWA operates. As EMET's New York chapter president, I thank you all for joining. For those listening in today for the first time who are not familiar with EMET, we are one of Washington, D.C.'s premier think tanks working on issues surrounding the Middle East and Israel. We work daily and tirelessly on Capitol Hill with meetings with senators, congressmen, and their staffers to develop and implement pro-America and pro-Israel policies with great success. Our work is critical to the survival of the Jewish people, both in Israel and in the diaspora, and I urge you all to learn more about EMET by visiting our website at www.emetonline.org. Please consider supporting our critically important work with a financial donation as well, as it is your support that helps us to be able to continue our work. These are very complicated and trying times, and pro-Israel and pro-America voices must be heard on the Hill, lest we be drowned out by the louder voices who seek Israel's demise and a diminished America. We appreciate your support. Today's event will be recorded, and you can also submit questions using your Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible a little later in the program. I did want to mention that next Wednesday, EMET will be hosting a webinar featuring Marcus Sheff of Impact Say. Marcus conducted a years-long investigation into Palestinian textbooks, and his findings and analyses have been at the forefront of both US and EU policy development towards funding Palestinian education. So I hope that you all can join us for the perfect follow-up to today's program. I am pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Asaf Romirowsky, the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, of which I am a board member and the treasurer. Asaf is also a senior non-resident research fellow at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies and a professor at the University of Haifa. Trained as a Mideast historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College London, UK, and has published widely on various aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict and American foreign policy in the Middle East, as well as on Israeli and Zionist history. Asaf is co-author of Religion, Politics, and the Origins of Palestine Refugee Relief, and author or co-author of many journal articles and book chapters on topics relating to international relations, the Middle East, and Arab-Palestinian refugees. He recently co-edited Word Crimes, Reclaiming the Language of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, a special issue of the journal Israel Studies. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Asaf. I want to begin our discussions. It's great to have you. I want to begin our discussions by asking you to provide us with some background on UNRWA, explaining its history and the refugee question that we've been reading about lately. In particular, can you explain the difference between the United Nations High Commission for Refugees and UNRWA, and why has the UN distinguished Palestinian refugees from all of the world's other refugees?
Sure. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Emmett. Thank you, Lori, for the opportunity to talk about this topic. It's been the focus of my research for the past few decades. And so I spent a lot of time trying to investigate the anomaly of UNRWA at large. To your question, UNRWA's anomaly or configuration in general was by design. I mean, the uniqueness of UNRWA, or the special case study of UNRWA, has been something that was created by UNRWA itself. And let me explain how that actually works and how we got to this anomaly. As you mentioned, there are two sister organizations devoted to the refugees at large. One is UNRWA, which is uniquely defined as devoted to the Arab Palestinians. And then there's the UNHCR, not to distinguish between the UN High Commissioner for the Human Rights Council, but the UNHCR devoted to the Refugee Council. And so the UNHCR, was created after UNRWA, and so a few months after UNRWA was created, which allowed UNRWA, which comes to fruition in 1949, to define and redefine themselves as an agency devoted only to the Arab Palestinians. And they uniquely define Arab Palestinians by anybody who was in mandatory Palestine between 1946 and 1948. Of course, that's to make clearly to underscore the fact that 2 years prior to Israel's coming to fruition as the modern state of Israel. And of course, what is the kicker here has to do with the fact that there is the descendants. No other refugee population worldwide allows for the lineage component, which of course is what UNRWA is allowed to create and to perpetuate, which is really what has allowed UNRWA today to say that if you ask UNRWA how many refugees are there worldwide, they will say that there are between 5 to 7 to 6 to 7 million refugees worldwide. And so when you ask the question where they all come from, this emanates from the fact that they have the lineage aspect that no other refugee population has. And again, UNHCR, if you go into the UNHCR definition, they only define a refugee by one generation. So if you basically try to parachute the more accurate and more honest definition of who is a refugee with UNHCR's definition within UNRWA's definition, you would amount to no more than, the estimates vary, but no more than 30,000 refugees worldwide, and then they could all get their right of return. The right of return demand is intrinsically linked into UNRWA's raison d'etre. That is to say that every Arab Palestinian demands a full right of return. We can go into what that actually means in practical terminology, but from an ideological political standpoint, the right of return is basically the eradication of the state of Israel. Or basically, it is the eradication of the state of Israel by demographics, as to say that the entire state of Israel, as we know it, will be flooded by Arab Palestinian refugees, all demanding a right of return. I will also stress this is not, according to the UNRWA narrative and the Arab Palestinian narrative, this is not only confined to the Palestinian areas. This basically is into the totality of the geographical map of the state of Israel today. So no Israeli government, to be clear about that as well, no Israeli government, left, right, or center, has ever accepted a full right of return. During all the courses of the peace negotiations and the conversations between Israelis and Palestinians over the years, it's been about the amount of percentages. And Israel has gone one step further, that is to offer compensation. And this is where the game has played into the political conversation as far as Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, as what are the actual numbers and how they all play into the conversation. The other part, which is critical to understand as well as it relates to UN issues, UNRWA itself is also an Article 22 agency. Now, Article 22 agencies by the General Assembly are based on what we call voluntary contributions. That is to say, in practical, pragmatic issues, there is really no transparency and accountability as far as the money that goes into UNRWA. That is to say that, they're based on voluntary contributions. So members of the United Nations, countries, and other agencies that have played into the monies that have come into UNRWA, they've been donations. And so when it comes to these voluntary contributions, in turn, there hasn't been much transparency and accountability as far as the accounting as to where these monies come from. So we know where the monies come from, in general terms, but this is also the same reason why auditing has been extremely difficult when it comes to UNRWA at large. So they define themselves who they are, they have voluntary contributions, and during the entire course of UNRWA's existence, they have always cried poor. That is to say, because of what they define as natural growth of who is a refugee, the numbers continue to grow, and thereby also the demand for more money continues to grow based on the so-called natural growth of Arab Palestinian refugees. So that entire architecture, to my mind, is manufactured and is fallacious. And this is where we have the problem that we're facing today as far as trying to fund this agency as to what the agency is supposed to do. That being said, also going back to the mandate of what UNRWA was intended to do, UNRWA was intended to deal, basically, handle the Arab Palestinian population until what they define into their own terminology, there is resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That being said, I would also argue to that point that they are the gatekeeper of the one single issue that maintains the conflict and ensures the conflict will never end by the ongoing demand for the full right of return. Well, that's the catch-22 that plays into the conversation. I would also say here that it's also critical for those of us here on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, and given the nature of the work that EMET does, UNRWA has also gone against, and also linked to that, as far as American funding related to UNRWA, we have also gone against our own mandate as it relates to funding these kind of our own American foreign policy. So American foreign policy, when UNRWA comes to the scene in the 50s and 60s, was rooted in three issues. That has to do with repatriation, reintegration, and resettlement are the three R's that relate to American foreign policy in general. On all three accounts, on all three demands, we have basically went against our own American foreign policy mandate when we have continued to fund UNRWA, because they did not do any of those issues as far as trying to achieve any kind of repatriation or resettlement at large when it came to the Arab Palestinian population. And so we have maintained and sustained the stasis. What I mean by that is a lot of the money up until the Trump administration comes to office has a third of UNRWA's annual budget has come from American taxpayer dollars. We have funded this enterprise that continues to grow naturally or not naturally, depending on who you ask, as a result of this architecture that was created by UNRWA and was allowed to that's been allowing itself to sustain and maintain itself by the international community.
Thanks, Asaf. You packed a lot into that response, and I have a number of follow-up questions that we're going to be touching on in terms of funding and whatnot. But before we take this a step further, I know that there's a State Department report or a study that was done at the request of Congress in 2012 that addressed the actual number of Palestinian refugees. But unfortunately, that study remains classified, including its conclusions on the estimates of actual Palestinian refugees. Do you know what the status of that is? Will that ever be revealed, and why would that be classified?
So that report was classified under the Obama administration. There was, to my mind in general, I mean, if you kind of look at, a lot of these monies have come in as a result of sympathetic support coming out of the State Department. I'm not surprised by the fact that that these numbers have been hidden or classified, for that matter. Again, as I said, I think that the estimations and from sources that I've spoken to validate, our estimations of the 30,000 about based on the original birth, the date, as far as the original the first generation of Arab Palestinian refugees. That being said, look, I don't think it's going to be an earth-shattering reveal of the fact of what the numbers actually are. What it would shed light is on the dishonesty of the agency at large. But the fact that there is still a lineage element that is intrinsically linked to who is an Arab Palestinian refugee, that's where the problem really lies. And that's a question of the fact that we have allowed who is a refugee, answering the question of who is a refugee by allowing UNRWA to define itself. The flip side of that is the fact that Congress and the State Department have funded UNRWA based on their numbers. And so every time there's an auditing or question of where these numbers come about, that should be the question. This is not sustainable based on the growth rate or this really that they have created. And this has, included inflation of numbers, resurrection of the dead. These are kind of the fallacies that have come into play when it comes to UNRWA. At this trajectory that we are now, there will be 20 million refugees, and they'll be demanding more and more money. I mean, so this is not sustainable. So I think that the number one issue, and really, if you go back to demand by the UNRWA accountability bill and others that have been proposed since the days of Mark Kirk and others of late, there was a bill by Langford, all demanding the end of the right of return. The end of the right of return really means, having an end date, a book ending the right of return based on who is a refugee. This is not a sustainable trajectory that we're in as far as our monies. I mean, I think that will shed light on the aspect, but we also have to put, a larger kind of historical perspective, as well as where we're going, future-wise, as far as funding this agency. And now that the Biden administration is going to renew its funding, these are questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you a couple more questions about funding shortly, but before we move on to that, I want to just have you briefly explain what it is that UNRWA actually does besides employing 35,000 Palestinians. Years ago, there were people like me and other pro-Israel Jews in the diaspora that were calling for UNRWA to be defunded and shut down because of the inherent corruption, among other reasons. And the Israeli government, I knew, did not want that to occur because they would be forced to pick up the responsibilities that UNRWA was fulfilling. Can you discuss, what are those responsibilities and whether or not the Israeli policymakers still believe UNRWA is necessary? Has that view changed over the past couple of years? And also, is UNRWA also operating in the West Bank, or is it just in Gaza?
Right. Okay. So let me start by explaining this. So the acronym of UNRWA, the UN Workers Relief Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, the W has been kindly translated into WORKS, and WORKS has been taken on to a level of what is known as education. One of the primary functions of UNRWA is UNRWA education. That is to say, and this will, probably relate to the conversation that Marcus will have, on your next webinar, as far as the textbooks. The majority of Palestinian kids are educated in UNRWA schools and the UNRWA school system, and to a point over the years where we've seen former superintendents of the UNRWA school system becoming official members of the Palestinian Authority and officials like that. So there is a political connection between the educational front and the political apparatus of the Palestinian Authority. I will also say that in the old days, again, pre-disengagement in the 90s and the Oslo years, we would assess basically the connection between UNRWA and other political factions, including Hamas and other groups within the Palestinian Authority, based on the teachers' unions that existed in these schools. I mean, there's direct connection between local politics, of course, and what we consider to be other kinds of international politics or Palestinian Authority politics at large, leading on in the 90s. So there is a lot of the social services, I would say some kind of medical services as well that have also been used, and education are the primary functionaries of basically what UNRWA does at large. Now, the Israeli perspective has been since UNRWA's creation, that what Israel does not contribute monetarily to UNRWA, Israel has not, as a government, advocated for UNRWA's dissolving or basically because the argument has been, as you mentioned before, basically that if UNRWA doesn't take care of these responsibilities, it's going to be our responsibility. So case in point, after the disengagement from Gaza, there was actually a query made by the Israeli Foreign Ministry saying, why does UNRWA still need to exist if we are no longer in Gaza? And so the response that was quite telling in general, coming out of UNRWA was, we need to take care of the communication or transportation between northern Gaza and southern Gaza, whatever that means. And so, but UNRWA operates in all Palestinian areas, including Gaza, the West Bank. Also, there are camps in Lebanon and in Syria. And so it doesn't only, but a lot of the attention focus really deals with the Palestinian areas as it relates to what is going on in the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic at large. So this is, where the operational level of what UNRWA does. Now, there has been a shift, I think positively over the past few years, that has come about as a result of efforts that were made by former Israeli MK Einat Vilf and the Department of Defense in Israel, and Netanyahu himself, that went on record as prime minister for the first time saying that UNRWA needs to be out of existence. That was never the case study. Again, for exactly that reason. There is a, I think that there is a, I'm being kind here. I think that there's not enough of an understanding of the historical issues when it comes to the Israeli Department of Defense. Their considerations when they're looking at the environment, as they look at the security issues, as they're looking at them today, they're not looking at historical issues and as far as the origins of UNRWA at large, which is why they have maintained it from a security perspective. It has allowed them to deal with the situation. Now, I would argue that that's not the case. And this is probably something you want to talk about as far as UNRWA's connection and involvement with Hamas. But UNRWA itself has become a conduit for terrorist activity, which also is a problem from an American foreign policy standpoint. That is to say that we are funding an agency that is dealing openly with terrorist organizations. And so that's a violation when it comes to those kind of sets of criteria as far as US money. And so Israel has shifted over the years as far as looking at UNRWA. And this is something that I've done over the years as far as looking at different connections between terrorist organizations and UNRWA at large. These are all part of the problems that we're looking at when you're looking at UNRWA, in general. And so that relates to the state of Israel, and that relates, of course, to American foreign policy.
So you brought up a point that I was going to ask you a little later, but I will ask you this question now since you brought up Hamas and UNRWA's connections to terrorism. You recently wrote an article, or you co-wrote the article with Alex Jaffe in the National Interest that was entitled "How Hamas Took UNRWA Hostage." And you wrote, and this is your quote, "Truth is a rare commodity when it comes to international organizations, all the more so when it comes to UNRWA, the internationally funded welfare organization for Palestinians. For UNRWA employees, truth-telling can be a career killer or worse." Can you explain what you meant by that and the relationship between these terrorist organizations and UNRWA?
Sure. I mean, it's a very telling point. I mean, so Alex and I, who've been researching UNRWA, part of the book that we wrote on the topic, there have really been rare cases. I mean, we can count maybe 5 or 6 cases since UNRWA's creation that UNRWA employees have aired UNRWA's dirty laundry. And so again, and what happens, which is, related to what happened now in Gaza is, of course, where you had a director of operations in Gaza who basically said something honest about the fact, and the quote that he gave, and I'm paraphrasing here, he said that basically the IDF's targeting and precision making was accurate. And so, of course, UNRWA and Hamas took that to say that, that in itself as a statement basically said that basically allowed for or endorsed the killing of Palestinian kids by the IDF, because he acknowledged the precision that the IDF had when it came to choosing its targets. There have been worse cases over the years, and one of the cases that we cited, that happened with the, with the UNRWA employee in New York, Andrew Whitley, acknowledging about solving it was related to UNRWA's ability to actually solve the problem altogether or deal with the right of return. The fact that one of the more famous quotes was given by the former head of the UNRWA Amman office early on in the 1950s, a former British general by the name of Sir Alexander Galloway, that had to do with the fact, and I'm paraphrasing here, the quote that the Arab world doesn't give a damn about the refugees. They want to keep it as an open wound to maintain and sustain the problem. All these individuals over the years who have had any kind of intellectual honesty about what UNRWA does have been fired, dismissed, or forced to resign. Whitley had to step back because he didn't want to lose his pension, and he apologized for his comment. Same now with the director of operations in Gaza. And so UNRWA is the way UNRWA is set up from a structural standpoint is that you have the majority, as you pointed out in your opening remarks, are local Palestinians. And so you have UNRWA employees in the tone of over 30,000 employees who are all Palestinians. And the internationals who are outside of, who are kind of monitoring the situation outside of the local environment and come in and out of the environment, they are indoctrinated by the local employees. Really what it is from a marketing standpoint, those business people and marketing people who are listening to us today, it is a case study of where the client has hijacked the service provider. And so you have this situation here where basically UNRWA today has become what I would consider to be a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. It is the largest employer of Palestinians, and they have created this infrastructure that has allowed them to thrive and have basically a shadow government that allows them to thrive on a variety of levels within the Palestinian political apparatus, all funded by West. The majority, a lot of these monies are coming out of Western donors, but a lot of these monies are also coming from the Arab world, which is again a whole other topic to discuss about the politics involved in Arab donor countries that are involved in contributions to UNRWA and to the Palestinian Authority, and how that plays into the configuration and the politics of all of this. But there is a connection. I mean, and this is another point that needs to be clear here. UNRWA does not do well at all when it comes to vetting individuals. And actually, what I mean by that is that you can be a gardener or driver by day and a member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas by night. Actually, it is showed, we've showed over the years, that's actually a sign of diversity, representing different groups in the Palestinian society. So they make no distinction when it comes to vetting what we call, when it comes to terrorist organizations. And the other part of all of this, which is also related to the funding, UNRWA over the years has also refused to accept the Israeli checklist and the American checklist. So their pool of people that they're pulling from when it comes to people that are involved in terrorist organizations in general are not the pool of people that we would pull from. So they have a much more limited account of individuals, and over the years, they have gotten in bed with Hamas. They have used their offices, like we saw now with the AP offices using Hamas's building, UNRWA schools. They've used vehicles of Hamas. So Hamas has basically used and abused UNRWA's so-called diplomatic community, if they had any, over the years, by using their vehicles and whatnot to transport suicide bombers of the sort. This is all part of the larger connection that they are basically in bed with UNRWA at large. And again, the bigger policy question for us, I think, is about the fact that we are funding terrorist organizations by these lines of monies that are going into these agencies, and in particular UNRWA at large.
It is mind-boggling to me that, just after this last operation, Guardian of the Walls, that the Biden administration is still hell-bent on funding this stuff. Well, I'm going to bring that up in a couple minutes, but before I do, you had touched on education as one of the responsibilities of UNRWA in the Palestinian territories. And the world is finally woken up to the fact that UNRWA schools and textbooks full of rampant anti-Semitic narratives, incitement of terrorism, and rejection of peace. In fact, UNRWA officials are now admitting that the claims that we've been making for years and years about their textbooks are actually true. So while I know Marcus Sheff is going to be on next week, and his study has actually delved very deep into the teaching materials. Can you just touch on what we know about what UNRWA is teaching Palestinian children, and whether you think that their recent promises to reform their educational materials will actually occur, or is it even realistic for us to be able to monitor those changes?
So what Marcus and Impact C have done, they've done a really phenomenal job as far as dissecting a lot of these textbooks. These problems have been age-old problems that we've been talking about when we're trying to get some kind of accountability and reform when it comes to UNRWA. One of the major demands that we've had here in the United States has been about reforming the textbooks. Much of the call for jihadism, martyrology, Israel's existence at large on the map doesn't exist in UNRWA textbooks. I mean, those are, simple examples of what we've seen in some of these textbooks in general. So when you, and let me also preface this by saying that during the Oslo years, part of the demand during the peace conversations was that both parties make their textbooks more pro-peace oriented. Now, Israel's textbooks were already pro-peace. The Palestinian textbooks were not, and so much of the reform needed to happen across the board within the Palestinian school system. And so, even the monitoring since the 90s, we have not seen much changes about, again, teaching about relations. One would assume if you got into a relationship between two countries like we're doing now with Israel's normalized relations with during the Abraham Accords, about teaching the other towards peace or educating towards the other towards peace, even Holocaust education, those things are not found. The Holocaust education is very critical to my mind because, according to the Arab-Palestinian narrative, the only Holocaust that exists is the Nakba. That is to say, Israel's creation in 1948. And so Israel's creation itself is a Holocaust. So they don't recognize any kind of historical elements that happened in the 30s and 40s. That is to, and I will also add to that, in tandem, it's also important to understand, they actually only recognize Israel's creation at large, if they are somewhat honest about the situation, as a byproduct of sympathy because of the Holocaust. So they do everything they can to minimize from the Holocaust at large in order to detach the connection between for Israel's existence. If the Holocaust didn't exist, there wouldn't be a state. So if we minimize its existence, we wouldn't be, we would disentangle ourselves from the connection between Israel and the Jewish people. And if the more egregious Holocaust, the real Holocaust, is the Nakba. So the focus has been by the Arab-Palestinian narrative, and also within Unrwa textbooks, is the focus on the original sin, that is 1948. And so that's how the larger kind of pedagogical understanding plays into all of this. And to that end, when we've seen individuals, and not many, who've actually acknowledged the Holocaust, they've also been fired. I mean, so this is, again, one case in point that I'm sure many of your viewers have heard about was the case of Muhammad Dajani, who was the former president of Al-Quds University, who took a group of Palestinian teachers to Auschwitz. And when he came back, he was fired because he dared to break the Palestinian echo chamber. But again, the very rare examples of people willing to break that kind of dogmatic orthodoxy when you're looking at how these topics are being taught and how history is being taught in general within the Palestinian areas and within Unrwa schools.
Yeah, it's very scary. It's called brainwashing, I suppose. Secretary of State Tony Blinken recently stated that while the Biden administration does wish to reverse the Trump admin's policy and to restart funding what I would call a very anti-Semitic behemoth, renewal of that funding, Blinken did say, would be conditioned on removal of hate from their educational materials. And ensuring that educational content taught in the UN schools and summer camps, quote unquote, respects human rights, as well as requiring UNRWA to commit to preventing the entry of weapons into Gaza and the improper use of UNRWA facilities to store those weapons. That sounds like it's good news, but my question to you is that realistic? Is it a pipe dream, or is it more like this administration's desire to re-enter the JCPOA, which is, I would argue, ideologically motivated, rather than, idealistic and naive? It seems to me that they're intentionally ignoring reality in order to achieve an end that is dangerous and harmful to Israel and the Jews. The fact of the matter is that from 1950 to 2018, American taxpayers contributed more than $6 billion to UNWA. And while the Trump admin suspended that funding, because it recognized that UNRWA was riddled with waste, fraud, and concerns of support to terrorism, the Biden administration is now replete with numerous Palestinian sympathizers and, I would argue, anti-Israel advisors. So the money spigot seems to be opening again. What are your thoughts on how Blinken's demands are going to be met?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think that, the spigot is now being opened up, and I think that the metrics as far as the tangible deliverables are going to be harder and harder to come by. They have, I mean, so again, with the exception of the Trump administration's case study where we basically shut off UNRWA altogether, the problem consists. I mean, American foreign policy, we have funded this enterprise since the beginning. And so by going back into traditional American foreign policy on these matters, the problems will still be there. And I think it's even more complicated and more convoluted now because you cannot distinguish between money that goes to the PA and money that goes to UNRWA. You can't tell us that the money is not going to Hamas when there's a marriage of convenience going on between these agencies. And I think that part of the problem is the auditing aspect. I mean, so, if you ask UNRWA, how many laptops and how many iPads did you buy your students? They can't tell you that. I mean, it's extremely difficult because it's one big black hole that monies go to UNRWA. And so what happens is when it comes to American foreign policy, when American foreign policymakers hear refugee, the perception is, there's a kind of a cognitive dissonance that plays out here, is that people are fleeing for their lives, no running water, let alone Wi-Fi. That is not the situation within the Palestinian areas. These are established homes, these are established towns and cities. And to even quote, apropos, your last question about one of the people who actually, another person who aired the dirty laundry on UNRWA, who wrote a study for the Washington Institute, James Lindsay, who was one of the former legal officers within Gaza, he admittedly openly said that all of these people have already been resettled. They're not refugees. And so the question of who are we giving money to and to what end, is part of this infrastructural problem. I would also argue further that UNRWA becoming a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority is double dipping. We're giving money to the PA, we're giving money to UNRWA, all of these services that should be, when it comes to social services, educational services, medical services, if the Palestinian Authority ever wanted to become a state to be or a state in the making, whatever they want, these services should not be given by UNRWA. And so we have maintained this refugee stasis, and basically they are, this is why you've created this failed environment where there's never a move to change that environment, because all we have to say to the world is that we are refugees, we're the number one issue, and so give us money. And so these UNRWA in itself is the number one barrier for any kind of shift or democratization within the Palestinian Authority if they wanted to move in that direction. So they play it both ways. On the one hand, they say, I want a state. But on the other hand, they say they do everything they can to prevent that from happening through the use of the apparatus of organizations like UNRWA and to maintain them in this situation. So that's the infrastructural issue. So when the Biden administration comes in to try to assess what we're dealing with now and saying we're going to ask for metrics and accountability and that, it is hard and far to come by, because what they're basically saying now is the money is going, because the Trump administration supposedly, because of the lack of funding, they're now demanding more operational money. So that's where the money is going to go to. And that's where the black hole is going to play out here. And unless you change this infrastructure that is playing out here without continuing to fuel the money, all you're doing is putting a Band-Aid on an already hemorrhaging problem that is going to continue from generation to generation. And that has been consistent. The Trump administration was extremely unique. So was the work of Nikki Haley to actually call a spade a spade. And I think that kind of action is critical. But if you're looking as far as abuse, to your point, and child abuse, the textbooks are the best example to show the low-hanging fruit as far as what are they actually teaching and the kind of generation you are educating the next generation to be. Basically, this is the kind of mini manual guerrilla warfare for Islamist terrorism. And this is how it's going to happen, by allowing this to happen through our school system, in a nutshell.
So, to follow on, you made some great points there. And I think it's important to point out that that what people miss in the context of Trump pulling UNRWA's funding was that it happened at the same time that they had their peace plan that they proposed, that, you know, everybody kind of poo-pooed at the time and no one's talking about it anymore because Biden's not interested in pursuing it. But he had a plan, and it sought to help the Palestinians build a true state with functioning infrastructure and a healthy economy, so that the money that was poured into the territories wouldn't simply go to building terror tunnels and missile and rocket launchers and weaponized drones and submarines. Yeah. You know, after Operation Guardian of the Walls, Biden's now claiming that the 200+ million he intends to send into Gaza to rebuild Hamas, after they launched 4,000 missiles, over 4,000 missiles into Israel, won't fall into the hands of terrorists, but will flow through UNRWA. And this is different than the hundreds of thousands of dollars that they are going to refund UNRWA with, correct? And
Correct.
how are we trust that UNRWA will be able to keep the money out of the hands of terrorists when they can't even clean up their textbooks? I mean, does UNRWA want to clean up its textbooks? Or does it want to keep money out of the hands of terrorists?
So over the years, they've claimed they've cleaned up some of their acts. I mean, again, these are smaller metrics that again, I don't think are enough. You know, if you talk about, you know, congressional funding and State Department funding, there's a section called Section 301C, which relates to, what is known as funding of FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations. And so to my mind, you're funneling this money, you know, by giving the money to UNRWA, you know, it may make you feel good for a second, but, you know, it doesn't prevent the money from getting to Hamas. I mean, they're working together. I mean, and the UNRWA response has always been over the years, as far as teachers, when you've gone to UNRWA schools and you ask the question, why are there martyrs of Hamas in the classrooms? Why are there posters here? And so the response is that if we don't have them here, then Hamas will, you know, do something bad to us, or, you know, or hurt us in some way, shape, or form. But you know, so you could say the intimidation factor, but they are one and the same. I mean, you know, and I think that we found over the years, PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad teachers who were chemists, and teaching, you know, and then working for PIJ by night. I mean, again, it's really hard because UNRWA does not, and, you know, when you apply for a job with UNRWA, it doesn't say, were you ever a member of a foreign terrorist organization? And so the vetting there is not good. And they see this as part of the population and part of their, as part of their constituency. And if you go back to the article that you mentioned that, you know, that I co-authored, again, it proves the fact that if you dare to break the echo chamber, you know, by UNRWA, then you're out of a job. I mean, Hamas is calling the shots. And so this is exactly, you know, part of the infrastructural problem as far as who it delivered the money to. Now, you can go back historically speaking, you know, you could say that, you know, when Salam Fayyad, who's probably one of the more cleanest Palestinians Washington ever had, and did everything he could to build institutions and democratizations, and did everything he could to change the environment to create a valuable, kind of sustainable Palestinian growing middle class. He couldn't complete the job because he wasn't, he was too clean. He wasn't corrupt enough. Hamas and Abbas were tapping his office, and they wanted the money. And the money, and when Fayyad was appointed, he was put there under Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and the money was predicated on him being in office. He could only stay there for as long as he could because of the level of corruption. And so it's extremely hard to distinguish between these agencies and where these lines of money are going to, which again has to do with the fact that there is no systems in place, there is no accountability in place, and this is where we do a much better job if you want to have a clear understanding of where our taxpayer dollars are going. When UNRWA will go again and once again ask for money again and demand money from Congress, which they've done every year, and they're not going to be shut down. One has to ask the questions: what exactly are our taxpayer dollars buying?
I'm actually going to I'm going to turn to the questions, the Q&A now. And if anybody does have a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can type in your questions, and I will hopefully get to it. But Asaf, you touched on something that somebody had asked that I was going to ask you about anyway, and it's you point out that money is fungible. And someone asked if there's any way to enforce the Taylor Force Act if the administration is determined to fund the Palestinians. That's an excellent point. There's also there's ICC legislation that says that if the Palestinians support a cause of action against Israel at the ICC, the International Criminal Court, that the U.S. would not be permitted to fund the PA. The Taylor Force Act, everybody is probably familiar with. It goes to making sure that U.S. dollars don't go to pay for slay, which is when the Palestinians fund terrorism or support terrorist families. Do you know whether there's any way to use those types of pieces of legislation or any other methods to prevent the administration from funding these things?
Look, I think that traditionally speaking, these topics have been bipartisan issues, and in the current environment, they have not been. And I think that's part of the problem as far as understanding exactly what we are supporting. One of the first people to bring this up, for example, in the House was the late Tom Lantos, who wrote Kofi Annan. And Tom Lantos says, I'm a Holocaust survivor. I'm a refugee. How do you guys actually still exist and you're in business? And what exactly do you do? I think that Taylor Force, all these, when it comes to pay to slay, and as far as when it comes to UNRWA funding and whatnot, I think there has to be an actual reality check here as far as what actually our taxpayer dollars are funding and to what end. And I think that the textbooks, when it comes to incitement issues that are happening in the mosques and in the schools, these monies need to be held accountable. And so there has to be to my mind, and if you want, again, as far as what are accountability and transparency, UNRWA has a monopoly over all these services. You have to break this monopoly. And UNRWA is a big black hole. So even if you want to talk about the slow reduction of UNRWA and bringing down the monopoly, which will not happen overnight, then you got to break the monopoly, take the monopoly out of UNRWA and start giving it to other services who can actually give you some answers as where the money is going. When the Canadians defunded from UNRWA for a few years, interestingly enough, the Canadians defunded from UNRWA under the Harper government when they left because of an EU report that spoke about incitement in Palestinian schools, apropos what we're talking about now when it comes to textbooks. And so I think that, there has to be a real, a drilling down on these services and doing actual needs assessment. This also goes to my first earlier point when we spoke about who is a refugee. The language proposed that have been proposed in some of these bills, it's not about saying that people will not receive aid based on need, but they won't receive aid based on a fallacious status, which is a blank check. And that's part of this needs assessment that needs to happen when it comes to actually figuring out exactly what UNRWA does, who UNRWA deals with, and what are its constituency, if you're going to start breaking and doing a real needs assessment about where the money is going to get the most bang for its buck.
Thanks, Asaf. I like this next question a lot because I think that people forget that there were a lot of Jews that were forced out of the various Arab nations, and that there are so-called Jewish forgotten refugees from Arab countries. And someone is asking, how many Jewish refugees would there be today if the same criteria of UNRWA were applied to Jewish refugees?
There was basically, if you're looking at the original numbers of 48, 49, there were close to 1 million Jewish refugees, between from the Arab world, and the more accurate assessment of how many were at the end of 48, 49 are between I would say between 615 and 625. There is distinction in the scholarship between Ephraim Karsh and Benny Morris, but that's a number that I would agree on. On the 625 number, I think is the most accurate number that I would subscribe to. And so the interesting part about the Jewish refugees, which UNRWA denies, is because part of the criteria is that that there is an actual a place to go to, people leaving for their lives, and the idea of resettlement, repatriation. So de facto of Israel's coming to fruition in 1948, they say, well, we have no obligation to deal with the Jewish refugees, even according to the criteria that UNRWA laid out, of anybody who was in mandatory Palestine between 46 and 48, but Jews don't fall into that kind of categorization, and they deny that existence, and they deny their existence because in some of the case studies, in particular when it came to Jews from Iraq and Syria and other places, Jews who left supposedly under their own volition were forced to sign documentations by those governments saying you can leave here with one suitcase and never come back and never ask for reparations. So those legal documents became their ability to leave those countries and stay alive, but also not demand any kind of reparations. So that's kind of the political architecture that's been laid out there intentionally, even in the early years, by the Arab world. This is another point that I was remiss to mention, but I think it's important to highlight. The Arab world, understood early on that the responsibility of the refugees in general is by the people who created the problem, and the blame was put on Israel, the United States. And so, because you created the problem, it's your responsibility to solve the problem, which is why they take no obligation, they take no responsibility and obligation for what took place in their minds, because what it would mean if they did is that they had some kind of hand in 1948. So that's how the historical kind of revisionism is played out here as far as their interpretation of history and how it played out from 48 going forward.
Interesting, very interesting. Somebody asked if it's true that 90% of the UNRWA staff is made up of members of Hamas, and therefore isn't just the United States funding a US and EU designated terrorist organization.
I'm not sure about that. I wouldn't say 90%. I don't think anybody has really done a real qualifier assessment. Again, as I said, when you apply for a job with UNRWA, when you apply for, a job application, it doesn't say there, were you ever a member of a terrorist organization? These are things that we discover later on. And the majority of the data, even the data that groups like COGAT had in Israel, as I was talking about in our opening remarks, had to do with the fact about the union. So you could tell basically on the teachers union the political fragmentation of their membership, including Islamist groups, Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas. And so you could tell those issues by the membership affiliations. A lot of that data is no longer accurate, especially since Israel disengaged from Gaza in 2005. And so, again, these rosters and these numbers, you see them in action, but it's hard to kind of validate them with the HR paperwork or when it comes to trying to do or census reports that we used to have before disengagement.
Someone asked if there's anything that we can do to see that the U.S. funding conditions are met. And in that context, I was also going to ask you, to share with the viewers what your suggestions are, if there's anything that we as American Jews and American taxpayers can do to help push for UNRWA reform, defunding. Are there other measures? Is there anything that we can do with the UN? What are your thoughts on things that could be done to reform this?
Well, I think all of the above. I mean, but I think that revisiting all these UNRWA accountability acts that have been shelved and never come to fruition. I mean, there needs to be pressure on to change all of this. I mean, I think that the textbooks has to do with really what I would consider to be a lot of the low-hanging fruit. I mean, you're basically you're indoctrinating young Palestinian kids to become into the Islamist narrative. that is, beyond child abuse. I mean, I think that we have to call a spade, and the fact that we're not going to fund terrorism in the same way that you wouldn't stand for that. In our own schools, why would you allow taxpayer dollars to fund this kind of activity? So I think there has to be demands of and put some significant checks and balances on these monies. Now, UNRWA is a bureaucracy. No bureaucracy wants to go out of business, and so they do whatever they can to make their case. But it doesn't mean that we have to fund this without any kind of without any kind of deliverables as far as where this money is going. I mean, and I think that the Langford bill that was put out there, the old Mark Kirk bill that was put out there. I mean, there's enough history of congressional language that has been put forth really since the 1970s of us trying to get a clear handle on the activities that UNRWA does that should be especially looked at. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's enough examples and data of how UNRWA has violated everything, since, including its own existence and growth over the years, that need to be looked at very carefully if we want to get a clear sense of where our money is going. Because as I said before, at this current natural growth rate of the situation, it's not going to be 5, 6, 7, 8 million refugees. It's going to be 20 million refugees. And so everybody demanding a right of return. That is not sustainable. And it's not going to work also from taxpayer dollars when basically you're seeing no end to the problem. All you're doing is you're throwing money on a problem that continues to grow and metastasize rather than to actually have an end game, which goes back to my original argument. To end, there has to be an end to the right of return. And that has to do with ending the refugee problem. And it has to go to the ultimate definition of who is a refugee. One has to bookend this problem and then stop the growth there. And then deal with all these problems that are basically coming out as far as education, terrorism, and whatnot. But you also have to end the numbers game, which are allowing this growth to happen, from generation to generation.
So someone had asked who's making the decisions on who is a refugee. They also extended it to who determines educational materials. Is it a situation where the inmates are running the asylum? And while we did touch on the behemoth in terms of the employees and the over 35,000 probably Palestinian employees of UNRWA, is it just in the original mandate that the lineage aspect of determining refugees is in the mandate, the original mandate of UNRWA, or is there somebody sitting in an office somewhere that's counting heads?
So so what happened was there was a growth and an expansion of the definition during the 60s and 70s, actually. So, for example, Muslim lineage was originally only patriarchal. Over the years, UNRWA has also made it matriarchal, so it includes both parents. And so these are all the kind of things that have allowed UNRWA to expand its definition when it comes to the lineage aspect. That's where the language has to be looked at very carefully and saying, this is really a fallacious argument, and a fallacious kind of, fact. I mean, you're talking about third, fourth generation refugees. They're really not refugees, so one has to also, I think at the argument of the comparison between UNHCR and UNRWA, as far as who defines the refugees. I mean, look, let's put it into the historical worldwide perspective. There have been millions of refugees since World War II. All have been assimilated with the exception of one population. That is the Palestinians. And so that one has to question, why are they still in existence? And so, we all have our refugee story, but, it is the only population that has latched onto this and kept it alive and well. I would also argue that part of that has to do with the fact that Palestinian identity is intertwined with Palestinian refuginess, and it has become interpreted as a divine right. So no Palestinian leader has ever the mandate to give that up. So when you tell a Palestinian you're no longer a refugee, say you're no longer a Palestinian. That's kind of the where this hold of UNRWA at large plays out here. But again, we have to. Those are the kind of language that we can include in reforming the issue and reforming the agency at large. And I think that the language that has been proposed, a lot of it is good language that needs to be revisited and looked at again.
It's 1 o'clock and we're going to be winding down. I'm going to ask you one other question, and then I think we'll call it a close for the afternoon. And Asaf, you've been terrific. Somebody had asked what role the new Israeli government will play in the renewal of funding, and will they object to the renewal of funding from the U.S. and the EU? And do they understand the fact that the so-called right of return is this major obstacle to peace?
Well, it's a very difficult question, to assess really, what the Israeli government, the new Israeli government is going to be looking at. I think that there are. I think it's become clear in Israel that UNRWA is a problem. To what extent is not entirely as visible to them as it is to us, I think, from sitting on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. I think that there are people, Bennett and Lieberman and others who've looked at UNRWA over the years and understand the challenges related to UNRWA. As I said, really, under Vilf and Netanyahu and others, there was a shift, in the movement in the Israeli government. That being said, I think that because all of this is looked at from a security standpoint, looking at the Israeli lens, they are looking at larger, more existential threats, and I'm not sure that they're looking necessarily from a priority standpoint at what UNRWA actually is or not doing. And so I think it's harder. This is not it's not on the top 10, maybe, tier issues that Israel is dealing with today. But I think that that's part of where, our friends like Marcus Sheff and others have been lobbying, in Israel and outside of Israel on trying to highlight these problems.
Yeah, I think that Marcus, with the textbooks, it's such a critically important issue, and someone had mentioned in the Q&A that's this is starting to creep into U.S. K-12 textbooks as well, and so it's not just a matter of indoctrination of Palestinians. Where now this indoctrination has gotten has expanded across the globe, and it's quite scary. And on that note, we're going to have to end.
That's one thing that's to clarify, Lori. So I mean, the one thing that the Israelis do pay attention to, and this is something that that isn't on their mind, is every time we have more examples of connections between UNRWA and Hamas, that does resonate. The more you can prove with other Islamist groups as well, that does seem to resonate, and it's clearly a problem.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. Asaf, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. You are a wealth of knowledge, and it's always a treat to host you on a webinar and have
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. Please do check out the EMET online.org website, and also please do check out the spme.org website. And we look forward to seeing you next week with Marcus Sheff. Thank you all again. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.